So to the main topic of the day, which is the Pegasus project. And I'm joined, it just appeared, by Cathal Mc Daid, the CTO of AdaptiveMobile. How are you doing, Cathal?
Hi, Patrick. How are you doing? Good to talk to you.
You too. So we're going to be talking about the Pegasus project. Now, Pegasus, as you may well know, is the name of the smartphone spyware or malware, depending on how you want to look at it, of the Israeli software vendor NSO. It's been around for years. It's been controversial for years. Project Pegasus is the collaboration of a number of human rights organizations and media outlets to publish information they've obtained about the usage of Pegasus by nation states over the course of the last few months. They published that information on July the 19th. Let's be very clear, the findings of Project Pegasus are controversial, and I'm going to try and summarize that as objectively as possible. Security researchers have generally acknowledged that the Pegasus project research into the delivery infrastructure of Pegasus and the forensics carried out on some of the victims' iPhones is of very good quality indeed. It proves pretty conclusively that the smartphones of some journalists, politicians, and campaigners were indeed infected with Pegasus in violation of the terms upon which the NSO licenses the technology. That much is clear. Anyone that cares about individual freedom, liberty, democracy, all that good stuff, a free press, should be unhappy, alarmed, and motivated to find ways to get those abuses corrected. And I stand very much as one of those types of people. I would share with you my response to the CEO of the NSO group when he told Forbes in July that if you're not a criminal, don't be afraid. I would share my response to that, but I doubt that the language I would use would persuade AdaptiveMobile to invite me to appear with them ever again. I don't buy that view of the world at all, and I hope that many of you don't either. However, what is a lot more controversial is the list of 50,000 smartphone numbers targeted by Pegasus customers that the researchers say they came across. This is the really controversial part, because 50,000 is a very big number, and that's what's been at the center of many of the media headlines around the world. The Project Pegasus folks have been a little bit dissembling, they're a little bit fuzzy, a little bit opaque about what that list of 50,000 targets represents and how they obtained it, which inevitably casts some doubt on its veracity. NSO themselves claim it was derived from using HLR lookups. Again, we do know that when the forensics were done on some of these 50,000 phones targeted, it turned out that they had indeed been infected by Pegasus. But that's just a handful of those 50,000 alleged targets. The veracity of that 50,000 number is still very much open to question, I would think. Now, Cathal, as I mentioned, this is a very controversial area. You're going to recognize that as well. What would you say about the way I represented that? Did I get it mostly right? A little bit wrong here and there? What are your first thoughts?
Hi, Patrick. No, I think you summed it up very, very well. It is a complex and it is a controversial topic. I mean, it's fair to say that NSO Group and the Pegasus software has been the poster child for the surveillance industry for many, many years now. This is almost certainly more publicity than they expected or they wanted, being the poster child. From our perspective, and we'll talk about this, but from our perspective, all publicity in this area is good. People aren't sometimes forget or are possibly not aware of the abilities and the sheer power that these companies can achieve with their software. It's great for some of these news reports to actually put a human face on people who's been affected, so people can actually see that, you know, it's not the types of people that possibly NSO Group purport to be that are being tracked. These people are not criminals. These people are not under whatever terms you want to call them. A lot of these people are ordinary people, journalists that are doing their job. So all this publicity is good. We see ourselves in our business, day-to-day business, we try to detect and block these surveillance companies from happening. So from our perspective, the more we can talk about them, better. But as you've touched upon it here, I mean, there are some questions about this whole area. There are some questions about the reports. But, you know, we think the research is very, very credible, like you said yourself. Right. The results look good. They have found traces of the spyware on the handsets. So from that point on, it has contributed immensely to the conversation.
Right. So now let's look at the origins of this list of 50,000 target phones. What do you make of that, Cathal? Now, very particularly, the NSO CEO making the case that the 50,000 targets was derived by HLR lookup. You guys know a pretty good amount about mobile networks. You know your HLRs inside out. What do you make of that assertion that that's where this list came from?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think the Pegasus project, by being a little bit vague about the origins of this, I don't think they did themselves any favors.
Right.
But I don't think it takes away from the quality of their research, but the vagueness about this is introduce some questions which perhaps there shouldn't have been. HLR lookups, we looked at this ourselves. We do see surveillance companies use HLR lookups. That's a perfectly credible method for them to use to do their attacks. Now, the strange thing is that the NSO group themselves, like you mentioned, they actually suggested this. This is where it possibly came from. That doesn't necessarily mean it came from that, but it's somewhat unusual that they would suggest this themselves. From our perspective, from looking at the list, there's a few things to remember. It's a bit confusing when you look at the list, but it's actually, when you look at it, the reports that they have, it's not 50,000 from 1 year. It's not necessarily even from 2 years. It's basically what we believe is a sequence of possibly overlapping series of numbers from up to possibly 4 years.
Oh.
So some of the reports that they were saying, and the NSO group were saying that this is impossible because 50,000. Nowhere did the Pegasus project, although it's not exactly clear, this is one of their failings, they didn't actually say it was ever 50,000 in one particular year. Those numbers are actually taken from different points over a 4-year period, and some of them happen to be 1 year, 2 year periods, but are from different points. As whether this could be happening from a use from a HLR lookup list, it could very well happen. We have seen ourselves, and we've reported, I've spoken at conferences, people using HLR lookups. Is very, very common. 50,000 is a drop in the ocean compared to that. FIMEs are not a problem. But there has been other reports as well. It may not come from a HLR lookup. There has been reports of a hacked NSO group servers in Cyprus around the time. And the interesting thing about it is that didn't actually come, those weren't reported to be from NSO group, but possibly from another company which has been connected to NSO group called Circles. So whether it came from an actual commercial HLR lookup provider or not remains to be seen, but there is certainly seems to be a strong correlation between those numbers on that list and people who are actually being spied because they found spyware on some of those phones.
I think NSO rejected pretty aggressively the idea that it was one of their own servers, did they not?
Yes, I think they did. And, you know, you got two different questions there. One is, you know, obviously themselves, if what they are saying is essentially truthful or not, that's their decision. It's hard for people on the outside to make that judgment.
Yeah.
And that's the same that they were. I mean, there's ways that, you know, you can interpret these statements. You can be entirely correct on a strict manner, but it may be not one of their servers. For example, in some of their reports, they have stated that some of these other groups, like Circles, have no relationship to them. And that is, strictly speaking, correct. But actually, there's certain holding companies which are in the background, which is all being laid out by NGOs who've done research in them. So from those strict legal perspective, they may be correct. But again, it's concentrating on the HLR list or the list itself and its origins. You know, that sort of takes people away from the actual methods and the actual evidence that has been obtained. If you start focusing on one small part, there does seem to be results that when they've looked at these phones, they have found spyware. And when we, in our own industry, when we look for it, we do see surveillance companies use HLR lookups. So those are all known techniques.
Right. Okay. Now, one of the issues, and I was fascinated in your use of the word poster child because it speaks to one of the questions I wanted to ask you. One of the issues with Pegasus, the Project Pegasus, is that it really puts the spotlight on NSO. And okay, fine, the spotlight kind of does belong on NSO, but a problem with it is that it kind of gives the impression to the mainstream world that NSO is some unique kind of actor in this space, whereas this whole environment of spyware and the infrastructure, the delivery infrastructure that's used to distribute it and support it and monitor it and use it is actually far bigger than NSO. So in that sense, that spotlight is kind of unhelpful and takes the spotlight off of everybody else. Now, you guys see a lot of this activity, and you're familiar with a lot of the actors in this market. What can you share with us, obviously at a discrete level, in terms of the scale of this whole ecosystem of spyware actors and the infrastructure that supports it and the modus operandi that supports it?
Yeah, NSO Group are quite unusual in the surveillance industry world.
Okay.
That I won't say that they seek the spotlight, but they are in the spotlight.
Right.
The most of the other surveillance companies we are aware of, they don't want the spotlight. It's not in their interest to be in the spotlight. Sometimes some of them don't have web addresses, they don't have email, they don't have web addresses, don't have a public presence, and if they are pointed out, they're quickly taken down. So you are right. It is unhelpful when people think, let's say, if let's say, imagine a world NSO Group went out of business, that the problem is solved. It's absolutely not solved. There's a whole enormous industry behind this, and most of these companies would much rather that their shadow be a lot larger than their public presence.
Yeah.
So from our perspective, when we are active, so we are active obviously on the core networks. We work with our customers or mobile operators, and they try to detect and block attacks over core networks. And from our perspective, the malicious activity, ignoring noise and other superfluous activity, the vast majority of malicious activity we see is generated by surveillance companies. And we're quite confident by those assumptions due to many years of doing this. It's not really, and we don't believe it's governments themselves doing it. There's also a small criminal element, but the majority of malicious activity, pure malicious activity, which is a small percentage, but this malicious activity is generated by surveillance companies. And the reason we think this happens is that countries don't have the expertise or don't have the time and they don't want to wait to build this technology themselves. They would much rather facilitate or use one of these surveillance companies to do it for them. And so this produces this drive, this incentive for this industry. And then there is a whole host of, not many, but there is certainly between maybe 20 to 5 or 5 to 20 different companies who try to offer these facilities to these governments.
Right. Now, in terms of solutions, obviously, a lot of the conversation around solution revolves around regulation, around tighter restrictions on licensing, revolves around politics, all very, very valid stuff, all very important stuff. However, it's not going to get people, to solutions anytime soon. What most people, what most high-profile individuals do, who are worried about this kind of spyware, who believe themselves rightly to be the kind of the tier one of targets, if you will, is they buy special high-end, very expensive software to run on their smartphones, and much of that software is actually pretty effective, to be fair. But we don't actually see that much in terms of the mobile networks themselves, the mobile operators themselves, attempting to deliver solutions that would render that smartphone software unnecessary. What can mobile operators do to be on the side of their customers against this type of spyware that we've seen with Pegasus and others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the whole conversation was very interesting from my perspective to see several days of the top world's media covering mobile malware and spyware. And the whole conversation seemed to revolve around the people being attacked on one side, the phones that they were using, and then on the other side, the people allegedly doing the attacking NSO Group. And everything in between was sort of essentially ignored. There was no conversation about what the operators were doing, even that they were present.
Right.
And clearly, because we work with them, we clearly believe that the operators do have a place to play in this whole conversation. Now, the exact method of the technique as we go to press, hasn't actually been revealed. The comments, so some of the intelligence is possibly an iMessage, at least for the Apple case, is an iMessage type of hack. There may not be much an operator can do there, but they are aware of these surveillance companies can be active in other bearers, like the bearers that we are active on. So this touches on an area I know that's close to your heart, Patrick, but in the area of intelligence sharing, this is possibly something which could be shared with and by the mobile operators to other actors who are working in the space, such as maybe the mobile handset vendors or other security vendors. So there is, I think, definitely more that operators could do. And one thing is that maybe if people felt it was safe to do so, if they are being targeted, they could possibly, ask even their mobile operator, do you have any information on this? Because at this point in time, I would suspect that a lot of people who might think they're being targeted don't even think to talk to the mobile operator or even involve them in the conversation. The same with the ecosystem vendors such as Apple or Google. I mean, are they involving the mobile operators in the conversation? Maybe they help maybe they can't fix the exact problem, but you know, they do and would know information about other attacks from the other bearers, which could be added together. Attackers like these succeed because they essentially divide us. They focus on one particular part versus a different part, and they believe in the industry isn't joined up. But the more joined up we are, the better then we can actually detect and stop these types of attacks.
You make a good point. I mean, I think if you know, business federations, chambers of commerce, and what have you, were to put their mind to lobbying their local operators in their domestic markets for this kind of capability, that you know, it becomes harder for operators to resist that kind of customer demand, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. The more voices asking for the same thing comes a stronger voice. I mean, also, one thing is that these attackers, from personal experience, we may have a danger of we big them up too much. They're not omnipotent. They're not infallible.
Right.
Like the latest versions of malware they have, yes, people think that they're very complex, that they live in memory, so that, you know, there's no detection. But the more complex you become, the more delicate you also become. Simple things like switching your phone off and then switching it on fully will defeat the malware. So the more that we share information, the more techniques we do, is that you'll be surprised how possibly easy it is to make a difference to these very complex attacks simply by sharing information.
Right.